Hello, welcome to Exploring Religion. I'm Kegan Chandler, and today I'm very excited to begin a new series on Tenrikyo, a Japanese religion, and a movement which scholars place in the category of shinshukyo, or new religions, sometimes in the West called new religious movements, or NRMs. In previous episodes, we've talked broadly about the category of NRM and also about the NRMs of Japan in particular, movements which have been founded since the early 19th century. And now we're going to begin a deep dive, and I'm planning on a very deep dive into one of the most well known and successful of these movements, Tenrikyo. And in this introductory episode, we're going to meet Nakayama Miki, the foundress of Tenrikyo. We're going to talk about her background, her divine revelation, her teachings, and even what she may have looked like. Lots of interesting stuff if you're interested in Japanese religions and in the general history of early modern Japan as well. I've really been looking forward to doing this video and this series for some time. And this is because, for me, Tenrikyo has been a fascinating tradition to study, and one which I've studied seriously for a number of years. It's really been an incredible academic journey. I've made friends with members of Tenrikyo and with scholars of Tenrikyo, and I've spent some time at their headquarters in Tenri City and at Tenri University. And what you're going to hear in this series of episodes is based on all of this research and my dialogue with Tenrikyo members and scholars. And I've probably also devoured something like 50 or 60 books and chapters and articles on Tenrikyo, something like that, maybe many more. Um, and I continue to have dialogue with members and scholars of Tenrikyo, some of whom have been kind enough to review some of my published work on their tradition. So ultimately, I've thought about Tenrikyo quite a bit. However, that doesn't mean that I've gotten everything right or that my journey of understanding is complete. And I certainly remain open to correction as I continue to work to understand and to represent this tradition as best as I can. And that's my goal here. To produce content about Tenrikyo and about the other religions that I cover here, which is not just interesting, but it's content which I hope that members of these movements will also appreciate, even if they don't end up agreeing with all of my interpretations or with everything I've said. I hope that members will at least appreciate that my studies are coming from a place of seeking to understand as best as I can and an attempt to represent things accurately. That is, of course, the overriding goal, at least for scholars of religion, to have a concern for accuracy of representation and not necessarily whether this or that theological or philosophical proposition made by any religion is true or false. Um, Though perhaps at some point I will also be giving my own personal thoughts on some things. I do plan to do that at some stage, maybe even soon. But here in this particular series of episodes on Tenrikyo, we're going to be working primarily from within a standpoint of the study of religions. I'm going to be giving some presentations about Tenrikyo's founding and its history, as well as the movement's many interesting teachings and rituals. And I think, to my understanding, this should all be the very first content of its kind online. I don't think there is anything on YouTube or on podcast platforms that's going to be bringing these subjects to you in this level of detail, at least not in the English language. You're only going to be getting this kind of media right here on Exploring Religion. But I should also mention that this is a series that will probably not show up all at once. In fact, I expect it not to. Rather, this is a series which I'll be adding to over time. There's going to be quite a few rabbit holes and other topics to pursue which branch off of this discussion about Tenrikyo. For example, discussions about monotheism in Japan, which is an area of particular interest to me. And also another topic that will branch off of this discussion about Tenrikyo is the subject of millenarianism in Japan. Since I argue that that Tenrikyo represents both a Japanese monotheism and an example of Japanese millenarianism. And so if these things are true, then this means that Tenrikyo, as a significant religious tradition of Japan is going to be of interest to not only scholars of religion and researchers of Japanese religion in particular, but possibly also to those who are interested in concepts like monotheism and millenarianism from a theological perspective. And I do argue that there is a good deal of conceptual overlap that can be located between Tenrikyo and other religions like Christianity. And we'll get into all of that eventually. But first, I've included here a few more photos that I thought you might like to see, which I took of the Tenrikyo headquarters. This is the Tenrikyo Kyokai Honbu, which is a beautiful, just incredible complex of structures built with unbelievable craftsmanship and care. They're really magnificent. And by the way, just one piece of information here about this complex, which I think will gain some of your interest. Housed in one of these worship halls is what Tenrikyo calls the jiba. The jiba. This is the place of the origin of humanity. Tenrikyo teaches that there is a small plot of ground inside this structure that represents the exact spot where God first created human beings. So this place is literally the homeland, if you will, as they call it, of humanity. And this is also the spot where a central ritual of Tenrikyo takes place. A fantastic dance called the Kagura takes place here, which reenacts the story of the creation of human beings. And also, very interestingly, this spot is also expected to play a role at the end of the age when a heavenly dew is expected to rain down and to nourish humanity. Really, really interesting teachings. And so if all of these ideas interest you, don't worry, we're going to get to them. We're going to talk more about the Jiba, the place of the origin, and these headquarter buildings and their eschatological role. We'll get into all of that very soon. But first, we're going to have to back up to the dawn of the 19th century and to talk about how this movement first began. The story of the founding of Tenrikyo will naturally begin with the foundress Nakayama Miki, who was born in 1798 and died in 1887. Or as Tenrikyo members would say, this was her withdrawal from physical life. And I want to give you just a brief introduction here in this section before explaining more about the historical and the religious context which produced this interesting person, Nakayama Miki. Miki was born into a farming family in what is now Tenri City in Nara Prefecture. And she was born into a time of great social and political upheaval in Japan. But after a series of spiritual experiences, including a divine possession and a revelation from Oyagami, or God the Parent, this took place in 1838, Nakayama Miki founded the Tenrikyo faith, which eventually came to emphasize divine healing, teachings about a monotheistic God, and the pursuit of what Nakayama called yokigurashi, or the joyous life, and the future world of the joyous life, yokigurashi no sekai. And despite very strong opposition from local authorities and from the Japanese government during her life, including her imprisonment and other kinds of abuses, Nakayama spread her teachings quite successfully among the general population, to the point where Tenrikyo in the 1970s had reportedly around 2.3 million members worldwide. And that number has declined, certainly, but at least according to a 2012 report, the current membership of Tenrikyo stands somewhere around 1 to 1.5 million people. These numbers are very difficult to nail down definitively, but we can make no mistake in describing Nakayama Miki's religion as a global phenomenon, though it's still, of course, primarily in Japan, and has something like 15 to 16,000 churches in Japan, and also, understandably, a strong presence in places like Brazil and Hawaii, where there are noteworthy Japanese populations. In terms of what the founders looked like, if you're looking for a photograph of the foundress Nakayama Miki, everyone wants an image to work with, right, when you're doing a biography. But getting a real photo of the foundress is going to be just out of reach for us. There were evidently a few photos that were taken of her, but what you see on the screen here, these are not actual photographs of Nakayama Miki. On the left here is a painting by Kiryu Horikawa. Reportedly, this painting was done during Nakayama's lifetime, so sometime before 1887. I'm not sure of the exact date. In the middle, you'll see a wooden statue that was carved, and this was done in the late 1920s. So this was done long after Nakayama Miki's passing. However, if you look at the image on the right, this is not a photo of her. This is one of her daughters, called Omasa. Some Tenrikyo members who knew her mother, they said that she was the one that looked the most like her. Though I've seen them mentioning that if Omasa had a somewhat longer face, then she would look just like her mother. And so when I look at this image in the center here, this wooden statue, it looks to me very similar to the image on the right in some ways, but she does have, as they say, a longer face. So maybe this wooden statue is as close as we're going to get. Now, there are reportedly some photos of the foundress which do exist, and which are said to be stored at Tenrikyo headquarters, and these are not shown to the public. I haven't seen them. They don't have them on the display. And from my understanding, Tenrikyo members themselves also have a hard time seeing them. And I didn't even ask to see them while I was there. But the rumors that I am aware of among Tenrikyo members say that in addition to a photo or maybe photos which were taken after her death, there is also rumored to be another photo um, that was reportedly taken when she had been incarcerated in Nara at the police station. There was a local jail, and she was reportedly treated quite badly there. And evidently, the policeman, or I'm not sure if he was the one in charge or just someone nearby, but he was impressed with her, and so he reportedly took a photograph. But anyway, I hope these images can at least be helpful for getting you an image, something of a mental image to work with as we continue in this series. I also think it's going to be very helpful for you to know something about Nakayama Miki's historical context. In 1838, which again, this was the year that Tenrikyo was founded, when Nakayama has her possession by God the Parent. At this time, Japan was still under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate. This was a military government that had controlled the country since the early 1600s, since 1603, in which the Tokugawa government coalesced its power after the fateful battle of Sekigahara. Anyway, another interesting history. But this Tokugawa shogunate enforced a rigid social hierarchy, with the samurai class at the top, followed by farmers, and then merchants further on down. And at the same time, Japan was operating under the policy of sakoku, which means closed country or chained country. This was a policy of national isolation, which restricted foreign influences and tightly controlled trade, and really restricted it to some limited interactions with China and with the Dutch in Nagasaki. However, by the early 19th century, the Tokugawa shogunate, which had exercised such an iron grip on the country, was facing serious challenges, very severe challenges. There were a series of natural disasters, there were poor harvests, and generally an economic decline. And all of this had greatly increased the hardships of life for the peasantry. And the 1830s in particular, which would see the birth of Tenrikyo. This was a period which saw widespread famine and social unrest. And of course, these are all the ingredients for peasant revolts against the authorities and the local governments, including there were unrest that were caused or precipitated by a series of government reforms. They were trying to to fix things. This was a series of reforms called the Tenpo reforms, which took place between 1830 and 1844. So hovering right there over the founding of Tenrikyo. And these government maneuvers had attempted to stabilize the economy, but they were mostly a failure. And there was, again, serious unrest amongst some sectors of the population, including there was a rise of movements which scholars call Yonaoshi movements, Yonaoshi, world renewal or world restoration. These were movements in which it was posited that a deity or a kami or a Buddha, a divine power, was on the side of the people and going to right the wrongs of the world. Divine powers were being invoked to change the situation in society. Sometimes people were saying that a deity or a Buddha was, going to come and personally take care of this the corruption at hand. Other times, people would launch their own peasant revolts and do it in the name of a deity. It's all very interesting, and we'll have to save details and all that for another time. But these Yonaoshi movements are fascinating, and I argue very relevant to the rise of Tenrikyo. But the point of all this that I'm making is that in this very charged climate, there were people, many people of the peasant and the farming classes, people were looking for hope. And so they turned to what we now call shinshukyo, early examples of the new religions or the new religious movements. They turned to these movements and their charismatic leaders who were providing the people with new revelation, with healing, which of course is important if you're having the spread of disease. And these leaders were providing the people with a new vision of human life, and a vision of the future, and so also a context for their suffering. And as we'll talk about in later episodes on Japanese millenarianism, these movements were providing people with an outlet for their pessimism about the world on the one hand, but also an outlet for their um, their hope, their very human hope that one day things could and would be better. Now, as for Nakayama Miki's homeland, she was born in 1798 in the village of Shoyoshiki in what is now known as Tenri City in Nara Prefecture. Obviously, you can tell that Tenri City is named after Tenrikyo. Um, but the Nara area has a deep historical and religious significance in the history of Japan, and it's a quite beautiful place to me. And I think to everybody that goes there, they come away in awe of its beauty. Nara was home to Japan's first permanent capital. This was in the obviously the Nara period, which starts roughly around 710 and lasts until 784 CE. And Nara proper remains a major center for Buddhist and Shinto traditions, and the area in general during Nakayama's time was known for its strong agrarian communities, which maintained local religious practices, folk practices, alongside these more established Buddhist, formal Buddhist and Shinto institutions. And I put up here a few clips of the train ride that you can take coming from the direction of Osaka toward Nara and toward Tenri City. You can see that the train is going to pass through this mountain. It's actually quite cool. And you can easily reach Nara from Kyoto. Right, you go from Kyoto or Osaka east towards Nara, and then it's a straight shot down to Tenri City. It's not very far. And here's another view once you get on the train headed to Tenri Station. During Nakayama's lifetime, this area was part of the Yamato province, which again I said was known for its agricultural economy, for its temple complexes, and naturally its proximity to the local power center. I'm sorry, to the political power centers of Osaka and Kyoto. Um, so this gets you a little sense of what it may have looked like. And again, Nakayama would have lived in a tight knit agrarian community, performing rice farming and other kinds of manual work. And as for her religious context, religious life in this region was characterized by a blend of various traditions, which of course characterizes the situation of Japanese religion in general. And I've listed some of these traditions here, which I argue to varying degrees would have been in the religious atmosphere that would have influenced Nakayama Miki. Um, Nakayama was originally raised in a Buddhist family and in the Jodo Shu or Pure Land tradition. And she at one point was very serious about becoming a Buddhist nun. So, given this fact, Pure Land Buddhism, we can say, certainly was part of her religious background. But beyond that, in her religious consciousness, her broader religious awareness, she would have been familiar with forms of Shinto and with Shugendo, which is forms of mountain worship, and also related movements and healing movements. We'll get into all of that in a second. And in her context, we know that there was also the influence of Shingaku, or heart mind learning movements. These were popular movements which were based on Neo Confucian moral philosophy and also based on Zen concepts. And there was also Kokugaku scholarship as well. This is an intellectual, scholarly tradition, an interpretation of Shinto, which did have a certain impact on agricultural communities like Nakayama Miki's. And I should lastly mention that I believe that it is possible, if not probable, that there was also the influence of the early shinshukyo, or the early new religious movements, like for example, the first of these new religious movements to be known as such by scholars, including Nyorai-kyo, and there was also Kurozumi-kyo. These are both Shinto influence movements, and they're both monotheisms, by the way. Very interesting. We'll talk about more about that in a minute. Though Nyorai-kyo owes significantly to Buddhism, if you can't tell by the name Nyorai-kyo, and Kurozumi-kyo is more Shinto, namely Amaterasu focused tradition, which is named after its founder, Kurozumi Munetada. And I believe that it is possible that Nakayama may have seen Kurozumi Munetada passing through Nara on his many pilgrimages that he would make to the Shinto shrine complex at Ise, or Ise Jingu. But anyway, my point is that all of these influences arguably shaped Nakayama's spiritual outlook to some degree, which she then would have as a background as she received divine revelation from Oyagami, or God the Parent. And yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about each of these Japanese religious traditions, both in this series and on their own. They're all certainly worthy of exploration. In terms of her early life, Miki was born into the Maegawa family. These were farmers, and from what I understand, they were moderately successful farmers. And as was customary at the time, Nakayama received little formal education, but she is said to have demonstrated from an early age a strong moral character. and a sense of compassion for others. And as I mentioned, she was reportedly very pious. She did want to become a nun in the Jodo Shu tradition. But at the age of 13, she was married into the Nakayama family. This was a respected household there in Shoyoshiki village. Her husband, Nakayama Zenbei, was a landholder, and he was a head of the village. And together they began raising a family, and Miki became known for her diligent work in managing her household, while also participating in community rituals and evidently in acts of charity. So, for the first 40 years of her life, Nakayama seems to have lived a very typical life of a rural Japanese woman of her social standing, and possibly and especially a pious one. However, one day in October of 1838, all of this would change dramatically, and there would be an event which would change the course of her life, and according to Tenrikyo, the course of human history. Nakayama Miki was one day called upon to perform a healing ritual for her son, Shuji. Shuji was not doing well. There had been a series of ailments, including a leg that was in significant pain. And the family had called in local healers to pray for Shuji and to perform healing rituals, including there was an ascetic monk who was local there. His name was Ichibei. And there was also a medium. I think her name was Soyo or perhaps Shoyo, if I'm not mistaken. And nothing was working, or at least the fixes were not lasting. And it was all getting very expensive too. You had to, pay for these services. And the official narrative of this story even tells you how much money the family spent, but I'm not remembering the amount now. But like I said, there came this time when Miki had to get involved in these healing rituals. And this was precipitated by a particular day in which Miki and her husband and Shuji were all having sudden pain at the same time. This was on October the 23rd. And in light of this situation, the family said, we need to do some prayers for deliverance from these afflictions. But the local medium wasn't available at this time. And Ichibei, the monk, he was praying, but he's proving ineffective. And so Miki herself steps in to offer the prayers. However, as she did so, she experienced a sudden spiritual transformation. Miki suddenly found herself possessed by a deity who began to speak through her. And this was not a deity whose name was known to the family. This was a god who called himself Tsukihi, or alternatively, Tenryo no Mikoto, or more endearingly, Oyagami, God the Parent. And this was a god who was ultimately identified as the true creator of the world, the creator of all things. But again, the family did not understand all of that at the time of this initial incident. But according to the story, this deity boomed his voice from Miki, saying things like, "Ware wa moto no kami, jitsu no kami de aru." I am the god of origin, God in truth. Evidently, this was a true God, a powerful God, rather than a mere lower level kami or a bodhisattva. This was the creator of all things. The voice also reportedly said, there is causality in this residence. And the word here, causality, is inen. And I won't get into this here, but it's something derived from Buddhist ideas. But anyway, God the Parent goes on and says, at this time I have descended here to save all humankind. I wish to receive Miki as the shrine of God. And this last part, is Miki o Kami no Yashiro ni Morai Uketai. And if you look at this phrase, Kami no Yashiro, or literally shrine of God, this is a term that can be found in the history of Shinto. If you saw one of our earlier episodes on the history of Shinto, you will have seen a discussion on something called yorishiro, which is an object which is able to attract and house a kami, a god, a deity, or a spirit. So a yashiro is a specific object which becomes possessed, and a person like a Shinto priestess could also become possessed. The term for that would be a yorimashi or a kamigakuri. But a yashiro, as used here in the Tenrikyo story, Kami no Yashiro, yashiro is actually another pronunciation of the kanji characters that are usually read as jinja or shrine, like a shrine building. So, for example, in the name of the current Association of the Association of Shinto Shrines, or Jinja Hansho, those characters for jinja or shrine in that name were sometimes read as yashiro. So, to be the Kami no Yashiro, this is literally to be the shrine or the sacred place where a god will dwell and really live. In Shinto, a shrine is not merely a place of worship like a Christian church or a Jewish synagogue. Rather, it is literally a house for the presence of the kami. That is what Tenrikyo says happened to Nakayama Miki. She provided an embodiment for the God of the universe, and he put his own words into her mouth. Now, later Tenrikyo theology will get more complicated in its explanations regarding what was happening here with Nakayama Miki. There's later going to be some discussion around what it actually means to say that God entered into the foundress, as in entered into her from the outside. And the reason for the discussion is because on developed typical Tenrikyo theology, the world is considered the body of God the parent. The world is the body of God the parent. And so that will make for some interesting metaphysical discussions about Miki and about all of humanity, which we'll get into in another time. But for the sake of the official story, it is clear that in some significant sense, God the parent was intending that Miki would become his vessel, the mediator between God and human beings. This was someone who was chosen to bring a message of universal salvation, a message about how to improve human life on earth. Now, at first in the story, Nakayama Miki's husband Zenbei and her whole family, they resisted all of this. They resisted her possession and the divine mission. They actually tried to negotiate with the deity. However, God kept repeating his intention for Miki's life. So finally, the family talks about it, and the family finally relents. And on October the 26th, they consented, and Miki became officially the shrine of God. And this is the event which marks the beginning of Nakayama Miki's divine mission and the beginning of Tenrikyo. From this period, Nakayama would gradually descend into poverty. She ultimately gives away their home, and she abandons her conventional role as a housewife and instead devotes herself entirely to spiritual practices, to healings, to preaching and teaching. She gave away their belongings. Like I mentioned, she gave away their home and descended into poverty on behalf of her divine mission. And she continued preaching, not just in her village, but also importantly, she traveled to Osaka, which, as I mentioned earlier, is nearby, where she began to preach on the streets about God the parent and about his intention that people would know him, would know the truth, and that they would improve their lives. Speaking of her teachings, I think it will be helpful for you in this introductory episode if we also cover briefly a high-level picture of what developed Tenrikyo belief and practice ultimately came to look like. Now, again, all of this is very high level. It's going to take some time and some future episodes to explain what I mean by all of these categories I have on the screen. But I believe we are justified in applying these comparative categories to the general situation of Tenrikyo doctrine and practice, allowing, of course, for some variation within the tradition and within the history of the tradition. But I think that what you find in Tenrikyo can basically be described in these terms. First of all, I describe Tenrikyo as a monotheism. Yes, you heard that right. Tenrikyo is a Japanese monotheism. And we'll get into that situation and Tenrikyo's interpretation or interpretations of their doctrine of God in the future. But in brief, I argue that Tenrikyo is a case of monotheism in Japan that owes nothing to the influence of Christianity or other Western influences. Rather, it is a homegrown Japanese monotheism, if you will. This is a religion which is clearly centered on a great creator God, the deity, God the parent, the creator of the universe and of human beings. Next, I suggest that Tenrikyo can also be classified as a millenarianism. So, in other words, Tenrikyo generally has an eschatological view in which human history is headed toward a new age, a new dawn in which the world will be positively transformed. So Tenrikyo has a this worldly orientation rather than promising its followers some other world, a life in a heaven or in a pure land, as in the case of Pure Land Buddhism. Also in Tenrikyo, there's been an emphasis on healing. Again, it began and was largely successful as a healing movement in the mid 1800s. Tenrikyo, to this day, provides its followers with something called the Sazuke or Osazuke. This is an ability for a follower to ask God through prayer for healing. It's quite nice to see this done. I actually had it done for me while I was in one of the main worship halls. One person sits behind another person. The Tenrikyo practitioner puts their hands on the back of this person, and songs are sung. It's a quite interesting experience. But speaking of songs, there's also a strong emphasis in Tenrikyo on ritual songs and dances. These are very, very important in the tradition. There are a host of really great songs with very unique and interesting hand movements that accompany all of them. I was very happy to also be able to see and to hear these and to participate in these while I was in Tenri. The songs are quite interesting, and many of them are drawn from Tenrikyo scriptures, which we'll talk about in just a second. And I might put a link to some of these that you can find on YouTube if you're interested in hearing what these are like and seeing the hand motions. In terms of the afterlife, I mentioned that the movement is millenarian, but there is also a belief in reincarnation. However, this belief in reincarnation will end up being somewhat different than you probably expected to be if you are knowledgeable at all about Buddhism or about Indian traditions based on karma. Definitely a very different metaphysics in Tenrikyo when it comes to human beings, and we can get into all of that another time. But there's also a strong emphasis on moral development. Causality, or inen, I mentioned that term inen earlier. This is not taken to be strongly fatalistic. There is a real chance to change your life, an obligation to change your life. In Tenrikyo, there's a chance to be a good creature, to take on the joyous life, the yokigurashi, which God the parent intends for you and which God intends for the whole human race. And the life of Oyasama, or Nakayama Miki, is called the Hinagata, or the divine model. Nakayama is the moral exemplar for the world, and Tenrikyo practitioners aim to pattern their lives after her example. So certainly a strong emphasis on moral development. And one way that you do this, one way that you develop morally, that you become who God wants you to be, is through a practice called hinokishin. Hinokishin is a daily benevolent act or a benevolent thought, which amounts to gratitude to God the Parent. Tenrikyo followers have a debt of gratitude to God for creating the world and for God's many blessings in their lives. It might be said that the entire Tenrikyo faith and life can be contained in this concept or encapsulated by this concept of hinokishin. These are benevolent acts, whether you're performing services or sharing Tenrikyo teachings. These acts qualify as hinokishin when they are done selflessly, when they are done with gratitude to God the Parent, rather than being done for personal gain. This is a sense of selfless gratitude, which really characterizes a lot of what the tradition is looking for in terms of its moral instructions. Um, and also, this is a force which energizes Tenrikyo mission work and charity work and things of that nature. But there's one other point of doctrine that certainly needs to be emphasized here. And this is a teaching which I find to be relatively unique in the landscape of Japanese traditions. And this is a teaching which plays a fundamental role in the entire Tenrikyo system of belief and practice, including their central ritual of the Kagura, which I mentioned earlier. This is a founding story in which God the Parent creates human beings. This is a primordial creation narrative, somewhat similar perhaps to the creation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden found in the biblical traditions. This is a story in which God creates human beings, creates them in Japan. As I mentioned, in fact, God creates them in modern day Nara Prefecture, right there in Tenri City, near the home of the foundress of Tenrikyo. Um, as I mentioned, this place is called the Jiba. This is the origin of humanity. There is a plot of ground which is said to be the exact place where human beings were born. This is the area around which Tenrikyo headquarters is now built. And by the way, I wanted to show you a few more pictures. This is what you can see when you enter the train station at Tenri. You will see these banners in this purple and white. Purple and white is the official school colors for Tenri University. But these banners say Yokuzo Okairi. Okairi in Asai means welcome home. So pilgrims will come here and they're greeted by these banners, welcome home, because this is understood to be the birthplace of humanity. So you'll see this messaging everywhere there. It's on billboards or items at the gift shop. And by the way, I should mention, I didn't take these two photos. I actually couldn't find my photos on my phone from Tenri, Tenri's train station. So I looked these up, and then I forgot where I got these photos from. So my apologies if you took these photos and I couldn't give you credit. I can't remember where I got these photos, but fair use and educational purposes and all that. But now getting back to the history, Nakayama Miki continued to preach and her movement continued to grow, and so caught the attention of the local authorities and the Japanese government. And she faced strong opposition from those forces, and Nakayama ultimately endured multiple interrogations and imprisonments and periods of house arrest. And on the screen here, I've included a photograph of a bust of Nakayama, which was sculpted by her nephew. This is an image representing Nakayama when she was detained at the Ichinomoto branch police station in Nara during a crackdown period in 1886, so toward the end of her life. Tenrikyo members call this her final suffering. It is said that when she returned home, she was never able to stand again after the treatment that she experienced there. Hence the distraught image here. It's a rather unsettling image of Nakayama. However, as the story goes, she remained steadfast. She continued to preach her message and to attract followers from diverse backgrounds, but largely from the mostly farmers and craftsmen and folks from the working class. In her final years, Nakayama Miki spent her time codifying Tenrikyo's teachings and practices and establishing the doctrine of the joyous life or yokigarashi as central and as the ultimate goal of human life. And eventually she passed away in 1887 at the age of 90, as I mentioned, very surprisingly, leaving behind a growing community of followers who continued to expand Tenrikyo's influence after her passing. And I'll do another video, another time on her passing and why it was surprising to her followers and all that. It's very interesting. And I'll note also that today at Tenrikyo headquarters, they mark her passing actually by playing a tune, by playing a song on loudspeakers there at the precise time of her withdrawal from physical life. I'm forgetting what time it is exactly and the name of the tune that's played, but you can detect it in several of the songs. But the people there will stop and they will have a moment of silence. They'll stop what they're doing and reflect in silence for that moment until the song ceases. It's quite moving to observe. But later in 1908, Tenrikyo was finally officially recognized by the Japanese government as a religious organization under the umbrella of Shinto, that is Kyoha Shinto, what we call sect Shinto. But Tenrikyo has never really seen itself, at least according to Tenrikyo scholars and theologians now, they'll say that it never saw itself as part of Shinto or a denomination of Shinto, though it did want to stop the persecution. And so it tried to find safety under this broad category. As I mentioned in another episode that we did on new religious movements in Japan, some of these groups in Kyoha Shinto had actually amended some of their doctrines in order to conform to government expectations and to the standards set forth by state Shinto, such as the veneration of the emperor. And Tenrikyo is a good example of this. However, after World War II, when religious liberties improved, Tenrikyo saw what it calls the fukugen, or the restoration, in which they restored their original teachings and texts, and including the texts that had been censored or even outlawed outright. And eventually, the movement withdrew from this Kyoha Shinto category, reasserting themselves as a unique revelation. And so today, Tenrikyo remains a significant religious movement in Japan and around the world. And I should mention that there have been several schisms and breakaway groups. For example, Honmichi. Honmichi is probably the most well known. But talking about why and all their differences is another episode entirely. But these groups continue to share much in common, especially the centrality of the founder or the foundress Nakayama Miki. And Tenrikyo centers around the world, Nakayama Miki continues to be revered as Oyasama, the honored parent. And her spirit is actually still said to dwell in a series of buildings, or in a particular building in particular, or especially at Tenrikyo headquarters. There had been a series of buildings in history which had been built to house her spirit. But the current one here is the one I've included a photograph I took of it on the screen. This is of the Kyosoden, or the Foundress' Sanctuary. Here she has a room where she sleeps, where she stays, where she has meals that are set out for her. And so this is a very sacred, very important place at the headquarters, and really represents how, for Tenrikyo followers, Nakayama Miki is a living spiritual mediator who exists in spirit with God the Parent and continues to confer blessings on the faithful. She has not left her disciples alone, according to Tenrikyo, but is actually now able to do more for them in the spiritual state than when she was with them during her physical life. So, Tenrikyo followers take comfort in these teachings and in the idea that Nakayama is with them forever, and they take comfort in the power of God, the Parent, the Creator, who is even now, as he says repeatedly in their scriptures, working to save humanity and to transform the world into the world of the joyous life. And scholars and historians of Japanese religion also continue to find Nakayama Miki a very interesting figure in the history of Japan. And we continue to find her movements worthy of investigation. And we'll continue to keep doing that on this channel, and probably quite a few episodes where we're going to talk more in depth about Nakayama Miki's teachings, the scriptures associated with her and with her movement. And I'll also be talking in particular about monotheism, as I mentioned, and also about millenarianism. She does some very interesting things with millenarianism, and I actually have an article in which I argue that Nakayama Miki is in fact a millenarian innovator in the history of Japanese religion. So I think she's quite special in this regard. So we'll certainly talk about all of that in the very near future. Until then, I want to thank you for joining us here on Exploring Religion. If you enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe and share the videos. All of that really helps our channel to get started. So until then, I'm Kegan Chandler. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye.